Good morning. Welcome to the American Museum of Natural History. We're ready to start. My name is Rob DeSalle, and I'm a curator here at the AMNH and the Sackler Institute for Comparative Genomics. I want to welcome you all to this very special event we have planned for you this morning in collaboration with Partnership with Children, the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University, DKC, and the American Museum of Natural History. Today's event will focus on how stress affects learning in children. Current neurobiology ascribes the foundation of mental health over the life course to a child's experience in the earliest years. Poverty is obviously a major stressor in a child's life, and we want you to join us this morning in a conversation that will explore the outcomes of poverty as a stress factor and how families, communities, and schools must be informed of this science. One question you might be asking yourself is why here at the American Museum of Natural History? This is, after all, the Dinosaur Museum. I wanted to first point out that the AMNH has a broad tradition of involvement in public health. Over a century ago, the AMNH mounted an exhibition focused on the public health scourge of the time, tuberculosis. It was attended by over 600,000 visitors in a 6-week period. The AMNH also had one of the first public health departments at a natural history museum in the early 1900s. CEA Winslow, widely thought to be one of the fathers of public health studies in the United States, was a curator in charge of this department before he moved to Yale University to found the long-standing and influential School of Public Health there. He oversaw the construction and maintenance of a Hall of Public Health here in the museum, that existed for about 20 years, and hopefully within the next decade we'll have another Hall of Public Health here at the museum. According to Winslow's view, public health was emergent, optimal, and mutable. Our more recent involvement in focus on public health issues includes several exhibitions, one called Epidemic, one on the genome, one on the brain, our currently running Countdown to Zero, and a currently running exhibition on public health and the microbiome. And that's on the 3rd floor, and I welcome you to take a look at that if you have a chance later on. Our Hall of Human Origins also carries a biobulletin theater with information about public health and the human condition. We are also a clearinghouse for public health by offering courses for teachers in genetics and genomics and neurobiology with our online course offerings for teachers. And equally important, we host 500,000 school kids each year from New York City. This fact has generated a skill and knowledge that our educators have attained about the educational needs and challenges of these school children. And of course, there was Margaret Mead, that giant of social and cultural understanding who was curator here at the American Museum of Natural History in the late 1900s. Mead was particularly focused on the influence society has on children. Her approach was synthetic, incorporating aspects of biology, sociology, and cultural anthropology. Her zealous defense of children of all cultures is best remembered in a quote from her. The solution to adult problems tomorrow depends on large measure upon how our children grow up today. Today's event, we hope, will take Winslow and Mead's lead and develop a synthetic approach to understanding this growing problem that impacts the most vulnerable sector of our people, children. Before we get to our panel, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Mary T. Bassett. She's the Commissioner of Health in New York City. Dr. Bassett has been an influential and guiding force for nearly 2 decades, serving as a Deputy Commissioner of Health and Mental Hygiene in the early 2000s. She established the district public health offices in East and Central Harlem, the South Bronx, North and Central Brooklyn, to lead targeted health and communication strategies in these communities. She was appointed to her current position in 2014 after a stellar 30-year career in medicine and public health. Please join me in welcoming Commissioner Bassett.
Good morning, everyone, and I'd like to thank Dr. DeSalle, who's disappeared behind the curtain there, for such a kind introduction. I have to tell you, when the First Lady of New York, Chirlane McCray, asked me if I could come here this morning and speak, part of the draw was coming to this museum. So it's a real pleasure to speak with you all gathered here today. It's really a pleasure to be in this museum. Growing up in New York City as a little girl, this was my very favorite museum. And I think that it tells us about the scope of the world, which is something that we are all visioning today through the lens of childhood. And there's another famous quote from Margaret Mead that we often invoke in public health, which is that we should never doubt the ability of single individuals to truly make a difference in the world. In fact, that is how change has always occurred. So I know that some of you here today are part of this effort, this transformation that we're all seeking to put forward by focusing our attention on early childhood. So before I move on to my remarks this morning, I want to acknowledge the organizers and the speakers. I want to recognize the Columbia Mailman School of Public Health, with which I've been associated for many years, the Partnership with Children, and of course, this museum, the American Museum of Natural History, which is our host today. And you're going to be hearing from some wonderful speakers, Dr. Champagne, Dr. Rao, Dr. Wilson-Simmons, Ms. Crotty, and Dr. DeSalle. So I'm sure that you're going to have a lively day. I wish I could stay the whole day with you, but it is a pleasure to make these opening remarks because the topics to be discussed today are both timely and important. Stress has not always been accepted as a valid construct in clinical medicine or in public health or even in the basic sciences. It's really a relatively recent development that we've moved beyond thinking about it as a feeling and begun to think of it as a deeply and profound experience that affects our whole body. Of course, everyone who's experienced stress knows that it affects our body, and we know that families, children, whole neighborhoods that are experiencing protracted and concentrated disadvantage disproportionately are burdened by stressors. So I'm really grateful to all the scientists here today who've worked tremendously hard with innovative techniques to bring stress into our national discourse. And it took very careful research and ability to communicate that research, and new insights will continue to emerge. It's well over a decade that I heard Vincent Felitti, who along with Robert Anda were two physicians supported by the Kaiser Permanente and the Centers of Disease Control, who led a landmark study on ACEs. Vincent was giving a talk in a sort of back room of a big conference with a handful of people there. And of course, we now know that the landmark ACEs study, that's Adverse Childhood Experiences, ACEs, has really changed the way that we think about childhood. Each adverse experience, whether it was abuse, neglect, domestic violence, or so on, constitutes an ACE, and in their study of 17,000 children in San Diego, California, they found a powerful connection between the number of ACEs and the incidence of health and social problems well into adulthood. They found that ACEs were far more common than they had anticipated. Now, this was a study of Kaiser members. This was a mostly white, largely middle class group of families and children, and 40% of them reported 2 or more ACEs. That's a number that should shock all of us. And of course, it's something that we've all come to learn from numbers of studies, is a consistent finding. So from ACEs, we moved on to the notion of toxic stress. This was a term coined by Jack Shonkoff, the director of the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University. And it was a brilliant use of language to convey a concept. It was meant to distinguish the kind of stress that we all need to develop properly and manageable stress. We all have to be able to learn to live and manage stress. But there are types of stresses that are toxic and can affect a child's healthy development. I want to take a moment, and I want to point out that the sort of epic work that was published by the Institute of Medicine that Jack Shonkoff chaired, From Neurons to Neighborhoods, is something that we took to heart a decade ago at the health department, and we studied, and it was part of founding the district public health offices. But it's important also to point out that we have to steer clear of developing a fatalistic attitude towards these forces, ACEs, toxic stress. A child exposed to these is not predetermined to have a difficult life or to have less potential, and should never be treated as such. When I think about the way in which we can get fatalistic about the relationship between stress and the brain, I remember a related observation from my work in global health. This was around the impact of child malnutrition. And the scourge of malnutrition at that time was undernutrition. Of course, we have different types of malnutrition today. And it was thought that stunting and undernutrition in early life led to permanent brain damage, and that the developing world and impoverished children in the developing world, millions of children, might be doomed to living out lesser lives. Now, we have since learned that when it comes to stress, we know that they make their way into our bodies and affect our lives, but our research has also demonstrated, or researchers have also demonstrated, the power of resilience, the ability to adapt, to mitigate, to bounce back in the face of adversity. So there's no doubt that we in public health have been very slow to adopt the importance of early childhood to the health of the people. For too long, we focused principally on child survival, on the idea that we wanted children not to die, which of course is a laudable goal and one that we have achieved enormously well. But we now know that we need children not only to survive, but to thrive, and that we must do much more than ensure that children have vaccines and medical care, to ensure that they have healthy early years. We have to make sure that our children can thrive as well as survive. So our work is truly cut out for us. We have the task of reducing exposure to stress, building resilience where toxic stress has struck, and I think that there's really no better place to work on this than in our city. And I hope you've seen the ways in which we've already begun to do this. Some of you may have seen our media campaigns. We had one that was called Talk to Your Baby. It appeared on social media, on the subways, on television, on the radio. It was aimed at trying to communicate highly actionable, very straightforward information that distilled scientific research and turned it into actions that people could take and have a large impact. Talking to your baby is good for his or her brain, was the message. It was that easy. And likewise, taking simple measures, making sure that your child sleeps safely, are also measures that we have put on our subways, on our airways, on the radio, and in social media. But beyond this, the city of New York, under the de Blasio administration, convened a children's cabinet comprised of multiple city agencies. I think it counts about 20. My favorite is the fire department chief, who comes regularly. So not just the usual players, but not just the agencies like the Agency for Children's Services that I was pleased to see is represented here today, or my own agency, or social services, but also the fire department, the Department of Finance, have attend the children's cabinet. And this campaign that I mentioned to you, Talk to Your Baby, was one that was actually done under the auspices of the cabinet. And it came along with a mayoral commitment to distribute 200,000 baby book bundles, including a little book written by the First Lady. For many years, the health department has been running a program to help new mothers through the first milestones of their baby's life, the newborn home visiting program, along with the nurse-family partnership, which we also have the largest single nurse-family partnership program run by a city in this country. It brings public health professionals directly into the homes of new moms and helps them with breastfeeding, with health and safety practices, and makes sure that mothers are aware of all the services that our city has to offer to new moms and their babies. And this is especially important in homes where the mothers may not know that they have the right to these crucial resources. And of course, there is the enormous effort that has been made for babies who are a little bit older, our 4-year-olds. The city's pre-K program has expanded to all-day, has enabled all-day pre-K for now 69,000 children. I want to pause and remind you what an enormous accomplishment this is. And the research of many people in this room is what underlay the administration's commitment to enabling this resource for our families. It's good for the children, it's good for their parents, and it also reduces the huge costs of childcare. So it's a way to eliminate present as well as future poverty and set children on a path to success, which includes not only better educational attainment related to pre-K and early years, but a whole host of improved health and social outcomes. Now, of course, in recent months, you've seen the First Lady and the Mayor, but especially the First Lady, launching a citywide mental health initiative under the title Thrive NYC. This is an unprecedented investment in making mental health a core part of our public health efforts and bringing mental health out of the shadows and placing it front and center of our efforts to promote access to useful services for our city. It includes 54 targeted initiatives, over 20 of which are brand new initiatives, and carries a price tag of $850 million over the next 4 years. So Thrive NYC is far-reaching and forward-looking. It includes, among other activities, a commitment to bring mental health training into everyday life with a program called Mental Health First Aid. We've committed to training 250,000 New Yorkers. Half of them, we hope, will be frontline public servants who are also trained in mental health first aid. The health and hospitals have committed to screening for maternal depression, along with a whole host of the private voluntary hospitals. And we are going to be launching in the fall of this year NYC Support, which is a web and phone-based point of entry for behavioral health questions, counseling, and referrals. Finally, I'll tell you a little bit about the Mental Health Services Corps. This will be 400 clinicians who will be deployed to primary care practices as well as substance use treatment sites around the city and high-needs communities to bring behavioral health more robustly into the delivery of primary care services. So these are just some of the examples of what research that begins with a study of the brain and the child and ends with policy and programs. And I should have mentioned, of course, paid family leave, which is now available to about 20,000 city workers, and we're hoping that it will be made available to all city workers going forward. So we take your research and your programs, and we endeavor to implement them at scale across our city, because that's what we have to do to ensure that we serve the interests of the city. And it's not just city agencies. This room actually represents the whole spectrum of the types of people who need to be involved in ensuring that we do better for our children. So today's event is yet another opportunity for some key institutions to amplify the movement to ensure that all children will thrive. I urge you to learn, discuss, and act on the information being presented today, because our little ones are counting on us. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bassett, for setting the stage for this morning's activities. I couldn't think of any better way than to have being addressed by Dr. Bassett for that. Now to our panel. I will now introduce our panelists individually and then ask each of them to present a brief synopsis of their work and how important their work is in addressing this very, very pertinent question. First, Margaret Crotty. She's the Executive Director of PwC. Margaret received her BA from Princeton University and her MBA from Harvard Business School. After graduating from Princeton, she spent 2 years with Save the Children, consulting on and evaluating community development programs. This past year, she took on the position of Executive Director of Partnership with Children. Margaret is also the Director of Everyone. That's Everyone. That's a organization. The International Save the Children Alliance's initiative to reduce to reduce child mortality in the developing world. Dr. Crotty.
Thank you.
Next, Dr. Virginia Rao. She's a professor of population and family health. She got her BA from Middlebury College, her MSW from Smith College, for social work, and her SCD from Harvard University. Dr. Rao is a perinatal epidemiologist by training, whose expertise is in the area of low birth weight and preterm delivery, particularly with respect to socioeconomically disadvantaged and minority populations. She's been a member of Columbia's faculty since 1984 and is Deputy Director of the Columbia Center for Children's Environment Health at the Mailman School of Public Health. Please welcome Dr. Rao.
Thanks, Rob.
Next, Dr. Frances Champagne. She has got her BA in psychology from Queen's University in Canada, her MSc in psychiatry and PhD in neuroscience at McGill University. She is currently a professor of psychology at Columbia University. Her current research includes the study of epigenetic variation that emerges in response to variation in mother-infant interactions experienced during development and the impact of prenatal exposure to stress, toxins, or nutritional variation on placental and offspring brain gene expression. Her work has been published in prestigious journals such as Nature, Science, and PNAS. Dr. Champagne. And last but not least, Dr. Renee Wilson-Simmons. Dr. Wilson-Simmons earned her DRPH in maternal and child health from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, a master's degree in urban journalism from the University of Minnesota, and a bachelor's degree in journalism in English from Shippensburg University. She has been the senior associate for adolescent health and development at the Annie E. Casey Foundation in Baltimore, an associate director of the Evidence-Based Practice Group, and director of the Health Promotion Program for Urban Youth at Boston City Hospital. In 2012, she joined the National Center for Children in Poverty as its director. Dr. Simmons. Everybody comfortable?
Sort of.
Okay. So what's emerging? See, they always put the misbehavior next to the monitor. What is emerging in this area of discourse is a consensus that there are measurable biological, physiological, and psychological impacts for individuals living in poverty. What I want our panel to do this morning is discuss the situation in depth with respect to children and to attempt a synthesis of ideas concerning this important topic. I want to now invite our panelists to make brief introductory statements to place their own work in context. Margaret?
So I'm Margaret Crotty. I'm the Executive Director of Partnership with Children. We work in schools, so that's what I know. We've been working in schools for over 30 years, working in very high poverty communities, so addressing the needs of children growing up in poverty. And I thought Mary set us up so well, so I wanted to share a vision of what Partnership with Children thinks of when we are building a climate in a school. So imagine a teacher calls you and says, not here's what your kid did wrong and here's how we're going to punish her, but today we sort of failed to meet your child's needs. And we've been thinking about it, and we're going to try some other approaches. She really communicated this to us really clearly. She acted out with her peers, and we're just not reaching her properly. So we're going to double down on our efforts, and we'd like to engage you in that effort as well. So why is that an unrealistic phone call? It does sort of speak to a shift from a teacher saying, I'm putting it out there and your kid's not strong enough, smart enough, good enough to catch it, to, we're really not fostering unlocking her capacity. And so we're going to figure out how all of us can work together to do that. And that's what we are trying to build a partnership with children. So we have social workers and community school directors who go in full-time. They're integrated full-time into schools, into about 40 schools around the city in all 5 boroughs. And our Staten Island principal is here today, just so delighted, all 5 boroughs. And yeah, exactly. We have a series of programs that we implement, starting with individual counseling for the highest need children, so those with the highest social, behavioral, emotional issues. So they meet with a social worker weekly in a trauma-informed care environment. Second, we do small group work, so we have small groups of kids, probably sort of the second tier of need, and that's working on skill building, executive function, decision-making, relationship building. We also work in classrooms, so we'll go in and work with teachers to reinforce, both for teachers and students, what a safe learning environment should be. We work with the entire school on systems building to make sure that no child falls through the crack. And then finally, and perhaps most important, and I think this was set up nicely, we work really closely with parents. We do all sorts of parent engagement work, and we bring them into the school. We work to educate parents on reinforcing what's happening in the school at home, because as you learn more about toxic stress, the antidote only works if it's in all the different environments that a child operates. So in our schools, we see increased attendance, we see increased student achievement, we see on a variety of metrics a safer, more conducive to learning environment. We also are now the biggest provider of community school services in New York City, which is probably the best or a very optimistic chance to meet kids in all their environments, providing all the wraparound health, mental health, and other social support services in a school, both for children and their families. So I think the way that we think about mental health in a low-income neighborhood is, as Mary said, there's stress and there's toxic stress. And when you have stress, your cortisol levels rise. This is the layperson's version, FYI. You'll get the other one, but this is how we think about it. So your cortisol levels rise. And if they're elevated for a prolonged amount of time and never given the chance to level set, that's toxic stress. And that has actually totally incredible implications for your brain development. It actually changes the architecture of your brain, and it affects the way we think about it, 2 parts of the brain, most importantly. One is your prefrontal lobe, right in the front of your brain, and that's how you develop executive function. So negotiating with people, differentiating between good and bad, thinking about the consequences of your actions, your social behaviors in a classroom, literally how you behave in the classroom. And second, your hippocampus. Deeper in the brain, that's where you learn memories, facts, not memories of skills, but memories of facts, things that you can declare and verbalize. Pretty important to school. So those are the 2 things that stress is affecting. Second, Mary talked about ACEs. What we know about ACEs is not only does it have short-term mental health effects, but long-term public health effects. So kids with multiple ACEs are exponentially more likely to develop cardiac issues, stroke, cancer, all sorts of mental health and social issues later in life. Our kids in our schools, we're seeing between a quarter and easily a third of our kids having 4 or more ACEs. So you know that kids growing up in low-income communities, and that's what Neurons to Neighborhoods is all about, have way more likelihood of multiple ACEs, and that's an exponential curve for the later effects on your health. So finally, if we go back to our teacher's phone call, and we think about what science is teaching us and why that is informed by multiple disciplines of science, we think, okay, one size fits all, it's not really working for us. So how can we think about each child's various levels of vulnerability and resilience? And resilience is built by 2 things in our minds, and this is everything in our program does these 2 things. Either fosters a caring and consistent relationship with an adult, a competent adult who shows consistency and caring and nurturing in a safe place. That's how your cortisol levels then drop. Second, building those executive functions. So if your prefrontal lobe has been compromised and you haven't had the chance to build those executive functions, we do that. So that's what we're doing in our small groups, that's what we're doing in our individual counseling, that's what we're doing school-wide. Second, we think of the whole approach, shifting our expectations. And so if we know that there's a predictable response to stress, then we can shift our expectations properly. So instead of saying, your kid is failing or your kid isn't doing the right thing, we say, gosh, we're probably not doing the right thing depending on, to reach this child and his or her specific abilities and resilience. And then third, we talk a lot about early education and early intervention. And yeah, from a neurological point of view, that is absolutely the best time to reach a child, and we wish we could do that. We get the kids a little bit later. That is the best window, but the window doesn't close. And so you can mitigate the effects of poverty later. And that's basically why we come to work every day, because we know that you can still reach those kids if you take the approach, a strengths-based approach, and figuring out how every child's resilience and vulnerabilities affect the need that they have. So for me, this is a total delight. I actually come from a background of child survival work, so to be talking about thriving is a total treat. And I think for us, and so many of our colleagues are here in the audience, I think we're hungry for the science to inform our practice better. And I think over the years, and Mary talked about this, there's been a science policy and a science practice gap, and these conversations are specifically to address that.
Thank you, Dr. Crotty. Dr. Rao?
So I want to start by saying thank you to Margaret Crotty, Joe DePlasco, Ruth Cohen, and their teams on behalf of the Mailman School of Public Health and Columbia University. I think it's terrific to bring public health to bear on this important conversation. I also want to thank Rob for the nice introduction and want to add that another component of my work is to co-direct with Dr. Neil Boothby the Columbia, the Child Health Initiative for Learning and Development. And our work collectively and individually focuses on examining some of the adverse consequences of these ACEs and stressful life experiences on the development of the brain and the outcome of these children, both in the US and globally. So I wanted to start by sort of redefining some of these socially toxic experiences, and to note that they include and are primarily associated with poverty, things like material hardships, which are unpaid family leave, as the commissioner noted, physical abuse and neglect, exposure to violence and interpersonal conflict in the family. Exposures to traumatic experiences, I think, are all highly stressful. And another category of toxic exposures includes exposures to pollutants, an alarming example of which is the experience in Flint, Michigan in recent months. And finally, such conditions as family illnesses, separation, incarceration, and maternal depression, not the least. So not surprisingly, most of these experiences are associated with poverty. I want to make a couple of key points. These experiences are not uniformly distributed across the city and across our children's populations. In fact, they're disproportionately distributed. And ironically, those families and children who are least able to bear the burden seem to suffer the heaviest burden. So this unequal exposure across a variety of conditions can be termed a sort of environmental injustice. And this includes a lack of equal access to healthcare services, jobs, high-quality learning environments, and safe places to work and play. And Dr. Wilson-Simmons will give a clearer, more detailed picture of conditions in New York City. So what are the consequences of these exposures? This has been mentioned certainly by the commissioner. Our work shows that the high exposure to a variety of these conditions results in cognitive deficits, cognitive delays, emotional disorder, and learning disabilities. So we see the effects directly in the classroom. And with the irony and the alarming reality is that children with socially toxic conditions and chemical toxicities, such as lead exposure and the like, are even more at risk for having adverse outcomes. So how do the biology behind this and the science, not to get too far down into the weeds, but how do these exposures actually affect development? Well, these adverse exposures, as Margaret mentioned, are actually biologically embedded in the brain. And this can have potentially devastating consequences for children's outcomes, especially during sensitive periods of development when the brain is growing very rapidly. So the brain changes are both structural and functional. And if the events are persistent or sufficiently adverse, the brain experiences a kind of remodeling or rewiring. And you can think of this as a sort of biological memory, rendering a child particularly susceptible and unable necessarily to adapt or self-regulate. Now, there is the good news, and I think everybody has mentioned that so far this morning. That is, the brain is a very adaptable organ. There's a lot of evidence that extremely positive experiences can help to buffer the adverse consequences of these adverse experiences. And they include, as has been noted, responsive parenting, high-quality child care, optimal learning environments, both at home and in the school setting, and neighborhood support. And furthermore, there's a good deal of evidence that there are individual differences in children's susceptibility to some of these adverse experiences. And Dr. Champagne's work, which she may touch upon, involves some of the origins of those individual differences. So how do we go about protecting children's brains and optimizing the mental health of children in New York City? From a public health perspective, and I'm sure the commissioner would agree, this is not just an issue of personal choice. It's a matter of equal opportunity, and we have to make it easier for children and families to lead healthier lives. As has been said before, we must make healthy child development the default option so that families are supported and can make the right choices in all the familiar settings: home, school, doctor's offices, and community conditions. In recent years, with advances in neuroscience of early development, the global conversation, as the commissioner noted, has shifted from child survival to what I would call investment in early childhood. We now have a very compelling rationale for influencing public health policy. And I'd like to end by saying, as the commissioner noted, New York City is taking the lead. New York City, Thrive New York City is a model program. It looks like we're going to be rolling out, in addition to consolidation of existing services, quite a number, over 20 new programs to help our children. And this whole initiative does no less than aspire to change the trajectory of children who are exposed to a lot of negative experiences in New York City.
Thank you, Dr. Rao. Dr. Champagne?
So what I'll do is probably reiterate a lot of the themes that have already been raised, but add a few of my own. So for me, one of the most compelling questions relevant to discussions of the impact of poverty is regarding the biological pathways through which poverty becomes embedded within us and affecting our behavior. But this is a challenging question. As Virginia mentioned, poverty is a multifaceted exposure. It consists of social stress, exposure to toxins, variation nutrition, just to name a few. However, a converging pathway for all of these exposures involves changes in the activity of genes, an area that I study. So epigenetics is a growing area of study which explores how environments and genes interact, how environments to which we are exposed change gene activity. This gene-environment interplay is fundamental to development and occurs in the brain in response to the social environment, to stressors to which we're exposed, to nutrition, and to toxins. In response to early life stress, genes that are involved in activating neuroendocrine circuits involved in stress reactivity are epigenetically activated. And those genes that help us to buffer us from the effects of stress are epigenetically silenced. These epigenetic changes are triggered by exposure to stress and potentially maintained across the lifespan. The resulting stress-sensitive brain will be compromised with regards to other functional domains, such as social behavior, learning, and memory. Stress interacts with all of these systems. Within the context of these discussions, I'd like to also note that in addition to interactions between stress and the brain, these two systems interact with the immune system, resulting in variations in physical health. Illness is also a barrier to social behavior and cognition. Moreover, bidirectional interplay between the brain and the immune system, it needs to be considered when we're thinking about the biological impact of poverty and its implications. Another critical element to discussions of poverty in the brain involve the multi-generational consequences of adversity. There is increasing evidence that experience of parents and even grandparents shape the developing brain of children and may be, have implications for individual differences that we see in individuals' response to stress. There are multiple routes through which this transmission can occur, including social transmission and epigenetic inheritance. The effects of poverty run deep within the ancestry of individuals, and this multi-generational perspective may be important to incorporate when we're thinking about how to intervene. I'd also like to make clear, as other members of this panel have as well, that these environmentally induced changes need not be lifelong or multi-generational. Epigenetic plasticity, though heightened in early development, can occur across the lifespan, and there's increasing focus in the basic sciences on how epigenetic consequences of adversity can become undone through shifts in the quality of other environmental features. Finally, within this context, we also need to know more about the process of resilience. Individuals who are resilient are not impervious to adverse environments. We build resilience. Resilience is an active process whereby individuals have positive nurturing experiences that allow them to offset the impact of adversity. At a biological level, resilience also has an epigenetic basis. Understanding how we can maximize the development of these buffering pathways while also reducing exposure to toxic environmental stress may be the best strategy for attenuating the link between poverty and mental health.
Thank you, Dr. Champagne.
Thanks. And, before I start, I hate to see all these people standing here. There are seats. Dr. Aratani has two people on each, seats on each side of her. There are seats here. So if you'd like to sit down as opposed to stand up, I would hope you would go ahead and do that. So I wanted to start by asking people to keep two facts front and center as we start our discussion today. And the first is that 16% of this state's population, and that's a little over 3 million people, are living in poverty. That's the first. And then the second is that there are about 4 million children in New York, and 23% of them are living in poverty. That makes them the poorest residents of our state. So just think about that for a minute. The youngest, the most vulnerable to risk to their health and development, as we've heard, and the poorest. And if we drill down and look at New York's 63 counties, those with the highest percentage of children living in poverty are Kings, with 34% living in poverty, Bronx, with 42% living in poverty, Queens, 21%, New York, 25%, Erie, is 22%. Now, I don't have any doubt that people feel like we need to do something about this. But the question becomes, what is it we do, and how can we engage the public in a way that brings a level of concern to a point where we're really going to make a commitment to make a change? And especially for those who are at greatest risk. And we're talking about children who are very young, those who are living in extreme poverty. That's half the federal poverty level threshold of about $9 a day per family member. Those who experience chronic hardship. And so these are the children that we're concerned about. And obviously, as the National Center for Children in Poverty, we're concerned about children. But I'd like to mention this is what we do with that concern. We help policymakers understand and adopt what we believe are the most effective policies and programs to deal with the economic hardship of families and the need for the development of children. That we work with advocates to develop and implement plans to influence public policy and resource allocation decisions, because that's the key. You can promote a policy, advocate for a policy, but we really have to advocate for the resources that are going to enable that to happen. We assist service providers because they're trying to turn research into practice. They're trying to understand what kinds of evidence-based programs are really going to make a difference in the field. We collaborate with other researchers to understand the policy implications. What is the research telling us? How can we use that to bridge the gap between research and practice? The byproduct of research can't be more research. It can't be more journal articles. Those can't be the byproducts. We really have to be research entrepreneurs and figure out how we turn that research into policy and that policy into practice. And then we work to try to encourage the media to tell the stories of poor children and families in America and really help them shine a spotlight on the power of prevention and intervention. And so the distressing thing that we've seen with the center, unfortunately, is a belief that children are poor through no fault of their own. And so they deserve our support, at least to a point. But poor adults, their parents are responsible for the sorry situation they're in. And so they have to deal with it as best they can. But that flies in the face of research, and it flies in the face of common sense, because children do better when families do better. And so that's our focus. We're the National Center for Children in Poverty, but our focus is on children and their families. And Margaret started out talking about a vision. And our vision is of an America where all families are economically secure, strong, and nurturing, so they can support their children to thrive and grow into healthy adults. That's our focus. And so what I wanted to do, you've heard about the issues of brain development, but what I wanted to do is have you look at families that are working, low-income families that are working to promote the healthy development of their children. There's a mother up in the corner, the far left corner, who's giving her child a playful lesson in spices, their color, their texture, their flavor. And her daughter, 20-month-old daughter, Allie, her favorite is pepper sauce because it's hot, hot, hot. The next one, and it's kind of hard to see because the light is on it, but it's a child and her mom who was recently released from prison, working with a social worker, and they're on the porch of the home where the mother lived and was abused as a child by the male relatives. This is, and I don't want to get their names wrong, this is Felix and Viva Torres. They were 7.5 months old at the time this photograph was taken, and they're in Greenwich Village enjoying the sights and sounds, and they hear Spanish and English at home that's spoken by their parents. Down here is in San Antonio, women working through the community to help parents identify the possibility of lead-based paint in their homes. At the very bottom is a father and his son. The father was the child of a drug-addicted mother. He has neurological issues. He has anger issues. He's trying very hard to be a good father. His son has anger issues as well, but they're trying and they're working together. Here is a father with 2 children, and he has actually gone through a program parents communicating with children that's actually a Brain Science Institute program, the University of Oregon. In this corner is a young woman from Pittsburgh who is with her child Tavon and takes online classes in order to advance her education. And finally, a young woman who's screaming. She's learned from their healthcare worker that that's a better way to let out her frustration than to fight with her brother. And so these are the kinds of low-income families that are trying to do better for their children. They're working very hard to make a way for themselves and for their children. And that's what we need to focus on. Children do better when families do better. And I believe in I understand the importance of research, but I want to close with a with a proverb, and it's work the clay while it's still wet.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson Simmons. I have a lot of questions, and I wanted to address one. The first one would be when we hear biology mentioned in a context like this, we oftentimes people think biological determinism, and the biology determines what the outcome is. And I don't buy that with this case, but I was hoping that Dr. Rao and Dr. Champagne could dissuade us of this knee-jerk that we usually have when we hear the word biology or genetics involved.
Right, so I think part of the fault in that lies in how we do science, right? So we're always trying to find causal links and link a gene or a biological change to an outcome, and no one believes anything you're saying until you do that. And so the framing of the work is always in trying to determine an outcome. But I think the reality is that you can have multiple different outcomes from any single biological change. And I've seen no biological change that can't be altered by some other event in life. And so rather, certainly we like to show causal links, but whether there is lacking in plasticity is another issue entirely. And I think making people understand that is difficult, because often we don't want people to take the science and say, well, my brain is damaged. I am epigenetically and neurobiologically damaged as a function of my early life experience, and there might be, a desire to maybe not do anything because the damage is done, right? But I think accepting that, yes, these long-term consequences are real and biological, but they are reversible is really the take-home message.
I think it's helpful to think of it in terms of a trajectory that really is determined by multiple conditions in early childhood from the prenatal period on. And many, many different conditions and factors would affect the sort of direction of the trajectory. But think also that the trajectory itself can be shifted by different experiences, and many people have noted the supportive experiences that can help to buffer the toxic consequences of stressors. So if you think about bringing very beneficial forces to bear to kind of overcome some of the early biological insults, you can think about shifting the trajectory and improving the developmental course of a child, both cognitively and behaviorally, over the course of a lifetime.
Great. When I was asked to moderate this, I just had a really hard time wrapping my head around it. And I wonder, do educators fully understand the long-term impact of poverty on their students? And this is for Margaret and for Dr. Simmons.
No.
Okay.
But I think that's why this is so exciting to have these conversations and to think through. And if you talk about stress as a risk factor but not a determinant, that sort of frames the whole way that everybody can think about it: parents, educators, schools, communities, sort of the whole host of people who are involved with children. And the part about the biological implication is that then you can also treat it. And once you know what it is, you know how to treat it. And I think sometimes it's not quite as sexy as we'd like it to be. It's actually really just having a safe, nurturing adult relationship. There's no fancy incubator. There's no fancy sort of drug. There's really just parents and teachers and community members spending time and creating a safe environment for children. I think for us, one of the other things is this is not just, and the commissioner spoke about this, this is not just a feeling. Stress is not just a feeling. It's actually something physical happening, and there are long-term implications. And once you sort of think through that, we're saving lives every day. And so, no, I don't think that that's how teachers come to work every day. And frankly, they need to have mindfulness and safe spaces, and they need to actually be able to address their own stress. And I'm not sure that most school environments do that.
I guess what I wanted to ask was if you were to prioritize how poverty impacts education, what would be the indicators? and how would those indicators direct you in the work that you do?
Well, now we're measuring ACEs, actually. So when kids come into our program, we figure out how many traumatic experiences they've had. And then you can predict what kinds of trajectories they're on and how to change that trajectory. So for us, that's been quite a remarkable way to look at our programs. I think the other thing is that the traditional indicators, how many discipline issues, how many crises, how many times the child has acted out, we look at those differently now. And instead of an end in themselves, sort of, okay, decrease the number of suspensions, we think about why and what are we doing to do that and what kind of environment do we create that would reduce those with a long-term view.
Dr. Wilson-Simmons.
And for us, the focus is really on early childhood. So it's even before children enter formal school. And I think a lot of those educators do understand the issues because they're working more closely with parents. The younger the child, the more likely a connection with parents. But even in those cases, often educators find it difficult to engage parents. And part of that difficulty is based on the kinds of difficulties that those parents are facing. We're talking about the issues of toxic stress and addressing them with children, but a key is the maternal depression of those parents. And so when we talk about how we need to address children, again, I think I'll keep coming back to the issue of parents and mothers, and that connection between depression and the kinds of social, emotional, and behavioral problems that children have are connected. And so if we want to engage parents, we have to support parents to support themselves and their children.
Great. I get the sense that we're calling this out, calling out poverty as a public health problem. I wanted to just see what your take on its place in public health is, and to address the impact of poverty on children. Is it really a public health problem? And that's another thing that I think will help clarify things.
I think it's foundational. I think it underscores a whole number of the problems we're talking about this morning. Many of them are disproportionately distributed. How we address poverty through our policies is very difficult. It's an insidious kind of illness, and it's very difficult to undo, but we can do many, many things. We can secure more optimal housing, we can improve the school environments, we can increase the safety of neighborhoods, we can do many things to help families, as Renee is saying, to feel more secure and actually carry out the job of parenting effectively in a healthy environment.
I do think that, so poverty itself is a social condition, and we'd love to be able to address that. But what we're recognizing is that children have, and adults, to Renee's point, a much higher level of stress and a much higher likelihood of stressful conditions and stressful experiences if they have grown up in a low-income environment. So that makes perfect sense, right? So we talk about the psychology of poverty, but now actually we're talking about the biological, like the physiological effects of growing up with that kind of stress. So, you know, if we don't accept the stress and the mental health implications, you know, you really have to accept the physical health implications. So literally 2 and 3 and 4 times more likely for cardiac disease, cancer. I mean, these are undeniable facts if you're growing up with that kind of stress. And so how do you design programs that will now mitigate the effects of that stress? It's kind of helpful to look at it from a public health point of view. And what I think is so delightful about this group is we're looking at it from a science point of view, from a policy point of view, from a practice point of view, to really address what it is about poverty that is having these effects.
And the only thing, the one thing I would add is that we often, I shouldn't say we often, but we need to look at and use the research that exists to determine what seems to make sense and what kinds of conditions the residents are facing. And so I will highly recommend, it's a first of a kind survey that was conducted by the Robin Hood Foundation and Columbia University's Population Research Center. So they've developed a poverty tracker for New York. And what they do is survey 2,300 New York City residents to learn how they cope with financial poverty, with the material hardship, health challenges, and they revisit it with the same individuals every 3 months over 2 years. So their goal is to provide a more accurate and dynamic picture of poverty in New York City. And so the first report in the fall of 2014 was called Meeting the Needs of Low-Income New Yorkers. And the second spring was, so that's backwards. The first one was spring, income, hardship, and health in New York City. And it talks about health or mental health, adequate or affordable housing, paying for food or bills, getting or keeping public benefits, encountering a major and unexpected expense, finding a job. These are the struggles, and they're trying to understand what New Yorkers are facing. And one of the major findings was that people most in need of help are the ones that are least likely to accept it or to seek it. And so we have to find what is the barrier to seeking help and how can we address that.
So then what types of intervention have been the most successful from your points of view?
Well, Dr. Bassett mentioned that home visiting is at the top of the list, but because then you're in control, you're in your own home, and you're having someone come in and work with you, understand how you live, what kinds of barriers you're facing. So home visiting is at the top of the list. High quality, affordable childcare is at the top of the list. Early Head Start and Head Start. Developmental screening, and again going back to this issue of maternal depression. We have interventions and programs that we know are working, and then one that we're hearing more and more about is two-generation approaches, because we're talking about promoting the healthy development of children and the development of their parents.
That is so key, and I think that's why this is so much fun. What we found is, as soon as you bring in parents, it's not just to check off the box of parent engagement. It's because actually their DNA has been changing, and poverty begets poverty, not just because of not seeking assistance, but also because there are all sorts of biological issues that parents are dealing with that then repeat the cycle. And so when you bring and so from our point of view, of course, we're working from the nexus of schools. You bring parents in, you provide, and we do a lot of home visits from the school, but once you engage parents and give them a supportive environment. So we have fathers groups, we have single fathers trying to raise kids. With a bunch of issues, including the physical and psychological issues of growing up from a place of scarcity, but also the stigma of asking for help. So for guys to come into our schools and say, I'm trying to raise this kid by myself, and to have other guys around there with the same issues, that's a pretty powerful thing. And one of my favorite quotes is this little boy, he's in second grade, and he's sitting next to his dad, and the dad says, "Do you think I'm a better dad because I come to the father's group?" And the kid's just like, "Yes, I do." And that's what the intergenerational effect of poverty is, and if we can break that, and that to us is something that we've been spending a lot more time and effort and resources on. Home visits, reaching out to the parents, figuring out what other barriers they have that are blocking the child being successful in school, and how can we support those parents.
And let's not forget the grandparents. I think there's tremendous emphasis in New York at this time in making New York a friendlier place for seniors. Lots of opportunities for various programs to bring senior citizens in as crossing guards, to read to children, many ways of getting them involved. And it certainly is multi-generational, and I think serves the entire family rather well.
Dr. Champagne, the problem is biological sometimes. I mean, part of it's biological. Are there going to be biological solutions? I'm hearing more social public health solutions than biological solutions.
So often when we talk about these epigenetic bases to various problems or exposure-dependent epigenetic changes, people's default, if I'm speaking to a more medical-oriented audience, would be to give a drug. Find a drug to reverse that epigenetic change. But again, that's only treating, it's a very non-specific treatment. I would never recommend taking a drug that would remove all epigenetic changes because we need most of them. And it's focusing too much on, I think, on the wrong level of analysis. And what we're hearing in terms of the other comments is interventions work best when they deal with more of the structural elements to an individual's context, so the family primarily. So we exist in a context. If we don't try and tackle that context, change the elements of the social environment within that context, you're going to have minimal effect if you just treat the individual and treat the problem as a disease state. Certainly appreciating something that is biological is certainly a worthy aim, but tackling the broader social issues that are driving that biological change, I think, need to be the priority.
I have two questions that I hope will hone in on potential solutions or potential, I don't know if solutions is the right word, but potential ways of thinking about it. And wanted to ask, what changes would be most effective in terms of services provided in schools? This seems to be, schools seems to be, they seem to be the places where you can get a lot of stuff done, get a lot of things done. So what about that aspect, services provided in schools?
Well, I think we've decided that schools are the best place just logistically to meet the needs of children and families. That's, I think there's a statistic that 20% of the country's population is in a school every day. And 67% of the children in New York City public schools are growing up in poverty. So that's a pretty efficient place to operate from. I think one of the things I've been thinking about as we've been talking is if we accept that trauma and stress are the reasons that a lot of some of these issues are arising, we want to do everything we can not to inflict more trauma or stress. And so coming from a place of strength-based, not a blame game, making sure that people feel comfortable getting over the stigma of receiving help, being part of their child's education, and even the kids coming into what we usually do is we have, in every school, we have a room, that's the Partnership with Children room, it's a safe place, there are mindfulness exercise, kids come there, parents come there, teachers come there for a safe place. And there's no trauma in that room. And they can, so anything that we can do to make sure that we do not inflict more trauma. So the call from school has to be a call of support. Don't remove kids from schools. So, we talk about the school to prison pipeline, but if we can reduce suspensions, it's also just so practical. If the place that kids are getting support is at a school, try to keep them there. And so let's think about, the ways that we can address behavioral issues, even academic issues, emotional issues, by keeping them in the school. One, again, that's sort of just practical. Making kids come to school. Make sure that they come to school, and we do that by making home visits, increasing attendance, figuring out what is the barrier. And again, some of them are not sort of sexy. You'd be amazed at how many kids are suffering from not having an alarm clock. And sometimes it's because in one of our schools, 47% of the kids are living in shelters within walking distance of the school. There was one child who was just consistently late and finally just stopped coming to school. We went there. What was happening? Well, the mother's cell phone was stolen and she couldn't afford to get another one. So a safe place for her to admit that. Who's she going to tell that to? So I think safe place, trauma-informed care, and that means every part of the school, not just the Partnership with Children room, but every part of the school. That's why the teacher would, that's representing a whole school. Principals taking on a trauma-informed approach to make sure that we're providing safe and supportive places for people, families, that don't inflict more trauma.
It sounds to me, too, that we need to make some policy changes in public health and in schools. What policy changes would be pursued given our new understanding of poverty's role and impact on the brain?
Well, I can't speak to all of that, but I think from a public health perspective, we think about social context. And when your goal is to get people into the school, you need to have, think about all the new pre-K sites that have been established over the course of the past year. Some of them are not in public schools. They may be in a church or basement, community center. We need to make those places safe to go to. so that these are not necessarily places with crossing guards. There may be rather dangerous intersections. Do we have the capacity to ensure that a parent could walk a child to school safely? So we need the Department of Transportation, the Parks Commissioner, various people on board with some of these initiatives, because unless you can bring people to the school safely, how are you going to engage a parent, and how is somebody going to find that safe space if they're not able to get there conveniently?
Yeah, and I'd like to call out another, in terms of policy and research that's been conducted. There was a report published March of last year by the Urban Institute entitled Poverty, Vulnerability, and a Safety Net. How much could policy changes reduce poverty in New York City? So what they found, and just to cut to the chase, the three things that they focused on is that the research suggested that them would have a profound effect on men, women, and children of New York City were the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, food stamps, that becomes a way not only to address issues of alleviating hunger and malnutrition, but improving the family's ability to use what little funds they have for other needs. The second was child care subsidies, and they found that families that had them could access higher quality care. And then the third, which I found extremely interesting, was this issue of transitional jobs, because in New York City, almost half of poor New Yorkers live in a family with at least one family member who's able to work, and that isn't disabled or elderly, but can't. And the reason they can't is that they're unable to find a job. So this transitional program connected these potential workers with jobs part-time that was paid for by the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And over 2 years, 260,000 transitional workers went through the program. Now, the funding isn't there anymore, but some states have continued it. And when we know that even a part-time job will help lift people out of poverty, I think that's something we should consider as well. And it's a way for people to transition and begin to gain the skills that would enable them to actually have and retain a full-time job.
And actually, amazingly enough, as we think about social determinants of health, that's what healthcare reform is about, is recognizing that child care, economic assistance, housing assistance are all social determinants. Those will help provide better health. And so as we slowly and clumsily transition to a system where healthcare dollars will pay for those supports,
Yep.
I think that's going to be really important.
Go ahead.
I think we haven't mentioned the word prevention sufficiently as a public health principle. And I think if you look at a variety of these negative or adverse childhood experiences, it is a problem to think later about how we treat and support children who've been exposed to these experiences. But I think public health as a field needs to go back to think about primary prevention. How do we, make the streets safer, the communities less violent, interrupt the violence? How do we make sure that these sources of pollution are really never out there? So we have a lot of work to do in that arena, and that's primarily policy.
This idea of simple solutions, looking for the very little solutions, tiny things that you can do, makes a lot of sense. If you think of malaria, which is a scourge, you develop chemicals that kill the mosquitoes. You develop, you sequence the genomes of the parasites and of the mosquitoes, and you spend all this money, and probably the most effective thing is mosquito netting. So it's very, very. I think we just have to dig in and start to find little ways of chipping away at this. I wanted to ask each one of you how your awareness of this problem and how your knowledge of this problem has changed the way you do your job. Margaret.
Well, I think for me, I'm not the one on the front lines, and so to those of you who are, this is a big shout out. But I think knowing that there are specific things that we can do to address specific problems that are frankly predictable really changes the way that you run a program. So instead of throwing everything at the wall and figuring out what sticks, you actually can address each child's needs in a much more efficient way. And I think in general, this is very optimistic for me. That you can sort of look at it both ways, but to me, I gain an incredible amount of optimism from not only seeing how many people are involved in this from different ways, but there are solutions, and actually we've been onto them for a long time. We're doing the right thing. We need to measure them. We need to make sure that we continue doing the things that are working. But I'm incredibly optimistic, actually.
So I think that one of the themes is, with all these people coming together to talk about these critically important problems, is that we're doing it on multiple levels. And I think working in teams has been incredibly important, so that the biology informs the social science and the education. And I think another thing we haven't really mentioned is that, we are a global society at this point, and many things are happening around the world that can inform our practice here. I think in some cases, and I'm sure Dr. Boothby would agree with me, there are many countries where there is more of a commitment, perhaps, to investment in early childhood as a policy these days. So I think it goes both ways. We can learn from what's going on out there and also try to communicate and train and offer expertise from, American urban environments in particular. But I think the biggest thing has been finding out how the biology can inform a whole range of other levels of intervention. I think we have to do multiple kinds of interventions at all different levels.
Dr. Champagne?
I would say one of the changes to the way I do things in the lab is to focus more on how we can offset some of these early life adversities. There's a profound amount of research showing how early life adversity affects various biological systems, the brain, the immune system, the microbiome. But that just identifies the problem, and trying to integrate more of a perspective of trying to prevent or offset those programs, I think, needs to be a more stronger representation in the research. So, because again, I think one of the great values of the biological perspective might not necessarily be in policy, because I think we know what things we should do. We don't need to know how this affects the brain to know we should do something for children. But actually allowing people to understand that this is not just some amorphous feeling that you have when you're stressed or when you're not able to attend in school. There's a biological substrate to that, is meaningful because it affects how we attribute people's behavior, that we don't blame them for the way they behave. We understand that there's a biological process through which these effects are being manifest, but also that we can do something about it, which I think is important.
Dr. Wilson-Simmons?
So I have come from a very different perspective in that it's growing up in poverty that propelled me to do the work that I'm doing, with a father who worked for the city as a garbage collector and a mother who cleaned homes. And we worked as hard as we could to get as far away from poverty as we could. But we understood how we were viewed by people: lazy, culturally deficient, criminally inclined, financially inept, reproductively prodigious. And that we understood that was the way we were seen, and we again tried to get as far away from those perceptions as possible. And I know that there are many people who grew up poor who have moved so far away from that, and they don't want to acknowledge it. I think when we can say, I was poor and now I'm not, and this is why. I was poor and now I'm not, but I had the kind of support that I needed to move out of that. And I think if we were able to engage those who have moved so far away from it and don't want to remember it, I think they'll help us build the kind of public will we need for policy change.
That's great.
I believe we're going to have some questions from the audience. You were handed out cards, so if you could please pass those to the aisle. Yeah, okay. Let's see. Do the members of the panel have any
Pardon me? What did she say?
She has a burning question.
Why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Oh,
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson-Simmons. You brought up exactly what I wanted to ask about, which was, one of the words no one on the panel has said today is race. And what we haven't talked about is how poverty yes, we know there's lots of poor people who are white in America, but the persistence of poverty and the insidious nature of poverty in communities of color is so powerful and stays connected to those. If you're black and you leave poverty, it's harder to really get all the way away because your family can pull that, and those health implications stay with people. And so one of my questions for all of you is, how do we think about treating those effects in the parent, the grandparent, or how do we think about enlisting people who have stepped away in terms of how many dollars, how much education they have, but who are still suffering from the long effects of growing up in poverty and growing up black and in poverty and Latino and in poverty specifically? Sorry.
I was whispering, I don't know the answer. And I think you're absolutely right that it wasn't mentioned. And for me, it's an avoidance because that's what's expected when we talk about who's poor and why. We think about the black and the brown. And I try to move away from that because the separation by, well, the issues of class is something else to address, but these issues of race and ethnicity and showing percentages of poverty in that way, I think helps to support the kinds of myths about why people are poor. So from that perspective, it's something that I try not to address as much as the issue of racial disparities and equity in terms of the way in which communities are served and the way in which policies are promoted or not, and the way in which dollars are allocated or not. And I think that our focus on poverty and what that does to lift up all is really what we try to focus on at the center.
And one point I'll add, so there's some very interesting science looking at how self-control aids children in adapting and attaining a high level of education. Most of that work had initially been done in Caucasian populations and showing all these advantages to maintaining self-control so that they could attain higher college and university degrees. But when they went to study in African American populations this phenomenon, they realized that yes, the same is true, that if you maintain self-control, that you can have a high level of educational attainment. The cost is incredibly high in terms of health. So it basically erodes your health so much, and that really, I think, speaks to the lack of safety nets and this kind of ancestry and all of the issues of stigma that go along with race that weren't considered when doing the initial studies.
And just last, we talk about ACEs, right? And we don't actually talk about the additional stress of all these different prejudices that have to do with race and other things that you enumerated and that we all know exist. And so if you start thinking about that, you can start addressing it. But I also think, and thank you for raising the question, because there need to be safe places to talk about it. And we all need to feel comfortable addressing it or not in the appropriate domains. And so for us, it's, we go into schools where it is mostly an African American and Latino population in almost every school. Not exclusively, but mostly. And we're actually trying, just among our staff, to have a safe place to talk about issues of race, because we haven't had that. And so that to me is remarkable, really, to have. We've got and it was something I felt so just stupid about. We have a bunch of white men who go into the neighborhoods as social workers, and they need to talk about it. We need to have safe places, not only for these groups, but actually on the ground to have these conversations and how people providing the services are feeling about it.
This is a question from the audience. Margaret has referred to creating mindfulness in the school environment. This questioner wants to know what you really mean by mindfulness.
Well, everybody's talking about mindfulness. So there has been a lot of talk about mindfulness, restorative practices, bringing those into schools. But if you think of just a stressful life, so you might be hungry, you might actually be afraid to walk to school, then you've got all these other things stressing you out, you're not exactly sure maybe where you're going to sleep tonight, and it doesn't even have to be that dramatic to be able to center yourself and take a deep breath. And so, they're not at scale yet, but there are a lot of programs in schools where it's yoga practices, it's breathing practices. I mean, I did it today. I sat in the subway station for an extra couple of minutes and I said, I'm going to have a moment of mindfulness just to center myself. And I think, teachers also, programs for teachers to develop mindfulness, something that we haven't paid a lot of attention to. But again, reducing your cortisol levels and reducing your stress levels so that you can actually build resilience. And so we think of mindfulness as a way to build resilience in both the staff and the faculty and in children.
And I want to add to that in terms of this mindfulness. I think one of the things that we don't think about that's a chronic stressor for children is just noise.
Yeah.
Noise, whether it's background noise associated with unmonitored televisions in the home. So not just outside, but in the home, or household chaos, or conflict between family members and visitors. And that kind of noise has a physiological effect on children. So I'm going to say that when we think about the stressors, noise is a big one, and it's not one we always think about.
This questioner wants the panel to address the mythology of pull yourselves up from your own bootstraps, and how we can garner support for work in this area in the face of that myth.
Yeah. I think that's a particularly destructive idea, and I briefly mentioned it because I think when we're looking for healthful behaviors, it isn't just a matter of personal choice. That's really blaming the victim. And in fact, it's the question of unequal opportunity. So I think it's extremely important to think about how we go forward to assure that those opportunities for safe neighborhoods and good jobs are more equally distributed across the population. So it sort of takes away the burden on those who really have the fewest resources to actually survive. And I think, as Renee was mentioning, for folks who grow up in poverty and are trying desperately to escape, again, there have to be positive social experiences, social context, loving parents, strong neighborhoods, and people who can actually help. And I think it's perhaps not as useful to think about the concept of pulling oneself up by the bootstraps. I think it's just, it has a little bit of a blame quality to it, and I think we should perhaps stay away from that.
You're absolutely right, but here's the problem, that a significant percentage of the population believes that.
Yeah.
And there was a Reuters poll a couple of years ago, and the majority, a nationally represented sample of the U.S. population, believed that if people worked hard, they could make it, when we know the research is telling us that the vast majority of the population that starts out at the bottom remains there. So it's absolutely true. There is a belief that that can still happen. And I think part of it is about these stories of rags to riches, but they're stories.
Myths. The next question from the audience is, can you speak to gender differentiation and biological response? This is something that we haven't addressed.
So all of the work that I've done looking at prenatal and postnatal environmental influences on any kind of biological outcome differs depending on whether you're male or female. And we don't, I would say, understand why that is. Males and females are different. They are different from probably very, very early developmental time points. So they have different placentas. They have different in utero environments because of the hormones around them. And so they are different individuals, and they're reacting differently to the environment. Now, in a lot of the prenatal literature, there's been a focus on male vulnerability to adversity. And whether that is true, certainly it seems to be true on a lot of the stress physiology measures. Whether it's true universally, I think females are definitely susceptible, but it may be that we're not assessing the kind of outcomes that they would be more susceptible to. When it comes to postnatal, a lot of the animal research is such that males and females actually get different levels of postnatal maternal care from their mothers. So there's already a starting point for differences. And so when you deprive care or create stressors, it will impact them differentially because of their different starting point. But yeah, so there is differences, whether they are because of genetics or epigenetics or because of hormonal environments, it's unclear.
This question, I'm going to try and combine two questions, actually. This question comes from a person who works with 7 and 8-year-olds who are acting out every day, and the parents are not responsive. What kind of a quote-unquote mosquito net, quick fix kind of small thing do we do to alleviate that or to address that?
Well, look, if we knew the quick fix.
Yeah,
But I love the question. So this is what we deal with every day, and I'm not going to pretend I have a perfect answer, but I think the approach is, don't give up on people, that you're still going to be able to reach them. So with parents who are unresponsive, thinking of examples that we have, so in a school in Sheepshead Bay where 28 different languages are spoken in the school building, we're like, why aren't the parents responding? Well, because they don't speak English. They're afraid to come to school. There's a bunch of reasons. And so what are the other reasons that parents are not responsive? Maybe they're under so much stress themselves, and we're not, and we need to provide some sort of stress relief. Maybe it's a home visit. Maybe you figure out what the other issues are. But pretending that any child or any parent is a one-issue person, it doesn't work. But I wish I had the mosquito net.
Well, I would say that don't forget, we have a responsibility to make more providers in the healthcare system available, multilingual providers. We have a real dearth of mental health professionals, and I think that Thrive New York City is going a long way to sort of maybe producing a cadre of health paraprofessionals. But we have a dearth of mental health professionals who could also step in, not just in the schools, but in the families and communities. And I think we have a responsibility to beef up the workforce in that domain and to make sure that the reimbursement processes, the health insurance, is able to cover parents' efforts to get that sort of service.
And that the services are culturally appropriate. And I think sometimes the problem becomes that we have to look backwards to how young people get to college, get to opportunities to be able to be the mental health professionals that we need. And this issue of cultural appropriateness is a huge one, especially when we're talking about issues, for all issues, but when we're talking about issues of mental health and a feeling that you don't understand where I am or what I'm going through, and you're here to help me, but your version of help is not what I need. I think it's part of that project I mentioned, where people who need the help aren't seeking it, and that's one of the reasons that they're not, I truly believe.
Can you speak to the epigenetics and psychology of immigrant communities in the U.S. who try to escape poverty, and how our discussion here may enlighten us about those communities?
So there hasn't been a lot of epigenetic work on immigration, but I think there will be increasing work. Part of the problem is methodological, so a lot of the tools are just being developed. But I think there is a sense that as you transition into a new social group, as you're exposed to new stressors, this will layer epigenetic information within your genome, with consequences for the next generation. And we know from some of the longitudinal data that risk of mental health goes up quite significantly in the second generation, probably as a consequence of this big transitional period during immigration.
I would also add to that we have a considerable problem of unaccompanied minors, and migrant workers, not just in New York City, but certainly around the country. And I think to the extent that we're able to provide more appropriate, culturally appropriate services for this group of children, it would be a great advantage. They're definitely marginalized and much more likely to be in a foster care system, particularly if they're unaccompanied minors, and don't necessarily have access to the kind of services that we're all talking about, as if we could all access them equally.
And then finally, this will be the last question. Is there a connection between the school to prison pipeline and research in this context?
Well,
Something that I think we didn't discuss either.
well, the school to prison pipeline of, a punitive approach that not giving the child or a youth the chance to restore or to stay in a supportive environment, basically suspending a child right away, having the police system involved right away. So yeah, I think it is exactly sort of based on the research that, again, we're not reaching kids' needs exactly. We're not giving them a place to, this is an important, an
They're
important
trying
question.
to move us out.
Subtle way, subtle suggestion.
But
Not so
I mean,
subtle.
I think this whole idea of making sure that children come to school are prepared to learn, that when they act out, or 95% of suspensions are not for violence, they're not for weapons, they're for what we call acting out. I mean, basically, and if you look at the research behind why children are acting out, in our teacher example, it's a cry for help, and if we respond to that by providing the right services, giving them a place of safety. We talk a lot about, again, mindfulness, a lot about restorative practices, trauma-informed care. That's exactly the opposite of yanking them out of a school, sending them down, into a suspension center, where they've now been cut off from what we've told them is going to help them deal with their stress. So I would say that is sort of the pinnacle of what the research tells us not to do.
Yep.
I think because the lights went down, there's this not so subtle message to end the proceedings. And I just wanted to thank the panel, and join me in thanking the panel. And I found this an incredibly just stimulating morning, and I hope that we have more mornings like this and afternoons like this discussing things, subjects like this. Thank you.